The Hinterkaifeck murders, Germany, 1922. In 1922, deep in the Bavarian countryside, an isolated farmhouse became the stage for one of the most chilling and mysterious crimes in history. A whole family was slaughtered, the killer vanished, and to this day, no one knows who did it. This is the haunting story of the Hinterkaifeck murders. Chapter 1: Prelude to Terror. In the rolling countryside of Bavaria, about 70 kilometers north of Munich, there once stood a lonely farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. The name itself came from its location, Hinter meaning behind, and Kaifeck, the nearby hamlet. To anyone passing through the region in the early 1920s, the farm seemed perfectly ordinary. It was a small collection of sturdy wooden and stone buildings surrounded by fields and forest, the kind of place that had weathered decades of labor, harvests, and harsh winters. Yet even from a distance, Hinterkaifeck looked unusually isolated. No close neighbors, no busy road nearby. Just the wind pushing through trees, the call of crows in the branches, and the heavy silence that settles over rural land at dusk. That silence, in time, would become one of the eeriest parts of its legend. The family who lived there, Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and her 2 children, were used to the solitude. In farming life, isolation was common. Days began before sunrise and stretched long into the night. Andreas, the patriarch, was known in the nearby town of Grobern as a strict and difficult man. Some said he was hardworking to a fault. Others whispered that his stern nature went beyond what was acceptable. By 1922, Andreas was 63 years old, his wife Kazilia 72. They were elderly by rural standards, yet still strong enough to keep the farm running. Their daughter Victoria, only 35, had returned home years earlier after her husband's death in the Great War. She brought with her 2 children, 7-year-old Kazilia, named after her grandmother, and 2-year-old Joseph. The Grubers were not well loved by their neighbors. Rumors clung to them, and some villagers avoided conversation about what happened inside that household. There were whispers of family conflict, of dark secrets, and of the stubbornness of Andreas himself, who was said to quarrel easily. This tension meant that while people knew the family, they were not closely connected. And so, when the first strange signs appeared, no one rushed in to investigate. Life on Hinterkaifeck seemed normal enough on the surface. The family tilled their land, tended their animals, and went about their chores. Yet beneath that surface, unease had already begun to creep in. For weeks leading up to what would later be called one of Germany's most infamous crimes, small incidents disturbed the quiet routine of farm life. Andreas noticed strange footprints in the snow that seemed to come from the forest and end at his farmhouse. Yet there were no return tracks leading back. The idea unsettled him, but he brushed it aside. Perhaps it was a wandering hunter, or perhaps he had not looked closely enough. He said nothing to the authorities. Then came the noises. Creaks in the attic late at night, soft but persistent. He searched the upper floors, but found nothing. No animals, no explanation. Soon after, household items began to disappear. A newspaper that no one in the family subscribed to, small tools, even keys. Victoria confided to neighbors that she felt uneasy in her own home. The family spoke in hushed tones of moving away. These incidents, though troubling, were not reported formally. In the rural 1920s, families handled most concerns on their own. Still, neighbors later recalled that Andreas mentioned the attic sounds more than once, and Victoria's friends urged her to take precautions. It seemed like someone, perhaps even more than one person, had already taken an interest in Hinterkaifeck. Spring of 1922 came slowly. Snow lingered in the fields, and cold winds pushed through the forest. On the surface, the Grubers carried on with life as usual. Yet unease hung over the farmhouse like an invisible weight. It is easy now, looking back, to see these warnings as omens. The strange footprints, the missing items, the whispers of movement at night. But at the time, they were just fragments of worry, nothing concrete, nothing that proved immediate danger. The family had lived in their farmhouse for decades, surviving hardship and war. Why would they imagine that the greatest threat was already moving closer, step by step, through their fields? The last days of March 1922 unfolded quietly. Victoria attended church. Andreas worked the land. Young Kazilia played in the yard. The animals were fed, the farmhouse kept in order. From the outside, Hinterkaifeck was the picture of rural Bavarian life. But the house itself and the forest that surrounded it held their secrets close. And in those secrets lay the beginning of one of the most chilling mysteries in German history. The silence of Hinterkaifeck was about to be broken, not by laughter, not by the sounds of farm work, but by something much darker, something that still echoes through history more than a century later. Chapter 2: Unsettling Signs. In early 1922, life at Hinterkaifeck seemed both ordinary and strange, a mixture of rural routine and quiet unease. For outsiders, the Gruber family was simply another household managing their farm in post-war Germany. But inside the walls of that lonely farmhouse, an atmosphere of tension had been growing for weeks. The Grubers were not a family free of complications. Andreas, the patriarch, was known for his harsh personality. He often quarreled with neighbors, and few in the nearby village spoke warmly of him. Victoria, his widowed daughter, was admired for her beauty and her singing voice in the church choir, but her personal life stirred endless whispers. Some claimed her father controlled her far too strictly, even cruelly. Others believed the family's misfortunes had roots deeper than mere bad luck. But what concerned the family most, in the weeks leading up to tragedy, were the strange disturbances that seemed to suggest they were not alone. It began with the snow. Bavaria's late winter had coated the fields and woods around Hinterkaifeck in a thick white blanket. One morning, Andreas noticed a trail of footprints in the snow that led from the edge of the forest directly toward the farmhouse. The prints were clear, crisp, and unmistakably human. Yet when Andreas followed them, he realized something deeply unsettling. The tracks stopped at the farmhouse, but there were no prints leading away. Someone had walked toward Hinterkaifeck, but apparently had not left. Andreas searched the property, circling the barns and stables. He checked the doors, the windows, the paths that led into the woods. There was no trace of an intruder, no broken locks, no damage to the house. And yet, the thought lingered. Who had come so close to their home in the dead of night? And where had they gone? He mentioned this discovery to a few neighbors, but no one knew what to make of it. Rural life was filled with odd occurrences. Hunters passing through, travelers losing their way, children wandering where they shouldn't. Still, there was something about these footprints that bothered Andreas. He remained uneasy but carried on with his work. Not long after, a set of keys disappeared from the farmhouse. It was a small incident, but for a household so far removed from neighbors, it mattered greatly. Every key was important. The thought that one had gone missing suggested either clumsiness or intrusion. Around the same time, noises began to echo through the farmhouse at night. Soft, shifting sounds in the attic, as if someone were moving slowly across the beams. Andreas climbed the ladder more than once to check, lantern in hand, but always found the space empty. He dismissed it as the scurrying of rats, or perhaps the wood groaning in the cold. Yet the family could not shake the sense that someone, or something, was above them, listening in the darkness. Adding to the unease, a newspaper appeared inside the house that no one in the family had purchased. It was a Munich paper, unfamiliar and out of place. Andreas questioned his wife, his daughter, even the neighbors, but no one claimed it. How had it arrived in their home? These events built up slowly, one atop another, until they weighed heavily on the household. Victoria confided her worries to friends at church. She admitted that she often felt watched, as if eyes were following her from the edges of the forest. Her little daughter, young Kazilia, sometimes woke at night, whispering that she heard strange noises. Andreas himself was reluctant to involve the authorities. He was a stubborn man, proud and distrustful of outsiders. For him, asking for police assistance would have been an admission of weakness. Instead, he kept the details mostly within the family, while quietly growing more suspicious of the world around him. Even the animals seemed unsettled. Neighbors later recalled that the Gruber's dog barked late into the night, snapping at shadows near the barn. The cattle were restless, as if sensing something the humans could not. Rural folk often trusted the instincts of animals, and in hindsight, these moments seemed like warnings. One particularly chilling incident occurred in late March. Andreas discovered unfamiliar tool marks on the lock of the farm's shed, as though someone had tried to break in. Nothing appeared stolen, but the attempt was clear. Whoever was lurking near Hinterkaifeck was growing bolder. Still, life carried on. The family rose each morning to tend the fields. Victoria sang in the church choir. Little Kazilia walked to school, her braids swinging as she joined her classmates. To anyone looking from the outside, the Grubers were simply enduring another season of farm life. But those closest to them could sense the unease. Victoria confided to her neighbors, the Assam family, that she feared something terrible might happen. She even considered moving away, though such a step would have been nearly impossible in their financial situation. In hindsight, the signs seemed almost too obvious. Footprints that led nowhere, keys that vanished, attic noises, strange newspapers, failed break-ins. If taken together, they painted a clear picture. Someone had been watching the Gruber family for weeks, perhaps even living close enough to observe their every move. But at the time, these details felt scattered and uncertain. They were uneasy stories shared over fences, quiet admissions whispered in church pews. The family may have sensed that something was wrong, but they could not have imagined the scale of what was about to unfold. Hinterkaifeck remained quiet in the final days of March. The fields were still covered with patches of melting snow. The farmhouse stood silent against the wind. Inside, the Grubers went about their chores, each perhaps brushing away their own unease. But outside, in the forest and in the shadows of the farm buildings, someone was waiting, watching, preparing. The unsettling signs had already been written into the land around Hinterkaifeck. What came next would silence the farm forever. Chapter 3: The Night of the Murders. March 31st, 1922, was a cold, gray day in Bavaria. The snow around Hinterkaifeck was melting into muddy patches, leaving the ground damp and soft. From the outside, it was just another day on the lonely farm. The Grubers carried on with their routine, tending to the animals, keeping the fires burning, preparing for spring planting. Nothing suggested that it would be their last day alive. Inside the farmhouse, the mood was quiet. Andreas, the stern patriarch, had risen early as always. Victoria busied herself with household chores, while little Kazilia returned from school, full of the usual chatter of an 8-year-old. Joseph, only 2 years old, coddled about under his mother's watchful eye. The old grandmother, also named Kazilia, moved more slowly, helping where she could, her age showing in every step. The family seemed unsettled that evening. In later testimony, neighbors said Victoria had seemed especially anxious at choir practice earlier in the week. Andreas, too, had been speaking more frequently about the strange footprints and noises. Yet, despite their worries, night fell on Hinterkaifeck as it always did, dark, cold, and isolated. At some point after dusk, someone entered the farmyard. The exact hour is unknown, but investigators would later reconstruct the sequence of events with chilling clarity. The killer, or killers, used an old farm tool called a mattock, similar to a pickaxe. It was heavy, sharp, and designed for hard labor. In the wrong hands, it became a brutal weapon. The first victim was likely Andreas himself. He may have heard a noise in the barn or gone outside to check on the animals. Rural life demanded vigilance. Any strange sound could mean trouble. Perhaps he stepped into the barn to investigate, carrying only a lantern. In that dim light, among the hay and cattle, he was struck down with the mattock. Next came his wife, old Kazilia. Perhaps she heard the disturbance and went to look for her husband. She too was lured into the barn, where she met the same fate. Victoria, concerned for her parents, would have followed. Finally, little Kazilia, the schoolgirl, likely came searching for her mother. One by one, they were drawn into the darkness of the barn, and one by one, they were murdered. The brutality did not end there. Later autopsy reports revealed that young Kazilia did not die immediately. She had clumps of her own hair tightly clenched in her fists, suggesting that she had pulled it out in terror and pain while lying beside her murdered family. It was a detail that horrified even hardened investigators. Once the four had been slain in the barn, the killer turned toward the house. Inside, Joseph was asleep in his crib. He never woke. The murderer struck him down with the same weapon. The final victim was the maid, Maria Baumgartner. She had only arrived that very day to begin work at the farm. She, too, was killed in her room, still surrounded by her belongings, barely unpacked. In the span of a single night, 6 lives were extinguished. The murders were committed with such cold efficiency that none of the neighbors heard a sound. No one saw anything unusual, no lights flickering in the distance, no cries for help carried by the wind. What made the crime even more chilling was what happened afterward. The killer, or killers, did not leave immediately. Instead, they remained at Hinterkaifeck. For several days after the murders, smoke was seen rising from the farmhouse chimney. Food was eaten, the animals were fed, even the family dog was cared for. Whoever had murdered the Grubers stayed in their home, living among their bodies, carrying on as if the farm now belonged to them. This detail has haunted every telling of the Hinterkaifeck case. The idea that someone could slaughter an entire family and then calmly linger, sleeping under their roof, cooking in their kitchen, and tending their animals, is almost unbearable to imagine. It suggests not only cruelty, but a disturbing patience. It was not until April 4th, several days later, that neighbors began to grow alarmed. The family had not been seen in town. Young Kazilia had missed school. Victoria had not been to choir practice. The mail lay uncollected. At first, people assumed illness or travel, but the silence stretched too long. Finally, a small group of concerned neighbors went to the farm to check on the family. They knocked at the door. No one answered. They stepped into the barn, and there, beneath layers of hay, they made the gruesome discovery: the bodies of Andreas, his wife, Victoria, and little Kazilia. Shock rippled through the group as they uncovered each body in turn. Horrified, they rushed into the house. Inside, they found the lifeless form of baby Joseph in his crib. In another room, the maid Maria lay dead, still in her bedclothes. The scene was beyond comprehension. By nightfall, word had spread through the village of Groburn and beyond. An entire family had been wiped out in a single night. The scale of the crime, the brutality of it, and the eerie signs of the killer's prolonged presence filled the community with fear. Farmers locked their doors more tightly. Children were kept indoors. Suspicion and paranoia grew with every passing hour. The murders at Hinterkaifeck were not just another crime. They were something darker, something that seemed to carry with it an air of almost supernatural terror. No one could explain how the killer had moved so silently, or why the family had been lured one by one to their deaths. And above all, no one could fathom how someone could kill so ruthlessly and then stay to live among the dead. By the time authorities arrived, Hinterkaifeck was no longer just a farmhouse. It had become a crime scene that would baffle investigators for generations. Chapter 4: The Discovery and the Investigation. The discovery of the bodies at Hinterkaifeck on April 4th, 1922, shook the quiet Bavarian countryside to its core. For generations, this farming community had lived by a rhythm of trust and familiarity. Families knew each other's names, children grew up side by side, and neighbors often shared bread, tools, and stories. Murder was something that happened in cities, never here, and certainly not on such a horrifying scale. The scene that greeted the neighbors was so gruesome that they could barely comprehend what they were seeing. Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, his daughter Victoria, and little Kazilia the child, lay stacked in the barn, covered with hay. Each had been struck down with terrible force, their skulls crushed. Inside the house, baby Joseph was lifeless in his crib, and the maid Maria, who had only just arrived, was found murdered in her room. News spread rapidly. By the evening, dozens of curious villagers gathered at the farm. Some walked through the barn, others peered into the house. Few understood the importance of preserving the crime scene, and in their shock, they unintentionally disturbed evidence that might have helped investigators later. Footprints were trampled, items were moved, and details that might have pointed to the killer were forever lost. The local authorities were quickly summoned. The initial investigation was led by Inspector George Reingruber of the Munich police, a serious man faced with one of the most disturbing crimes in Bavarian history. Upon arrival, Reingruber was struck not only by the brutality of the murders, but also by the eerie signs of someone having lived in the farmhouse after the killings. The animals in the barn were fed. The cows had been milked. Bread and meat had been consumed in the kitchen. The stove had been used. Whoever the murderer was, they had lingered at Hinterkaifeck for days, calmly carrying out daily chores while the family's bodies lay nearby. This single fact unsettled investigators more than anything else. It suggested a cold, calculating presence, someone capable of both violence and patience. Dr. Johann Baptist Aumler, a respected medical examiner, performed the autopsies on site in the barn, as was customary at the time. His findings were grim. Andreas Gruber had suffered severe head trauma, his skull split open by multiple blows. His wife, Kazilia, had similar injuries. Victoria, too, had been struck repeatedly, with one blow crushing her skull so badly it revealed brain matter. The youngest victim, little Kazilia, had a shattered jaw and evidence that she had survived for several hours after the attack, likely in agony. Joseph, the infant, had been killed by a single blow to the head. Maria, the maid, had been struck in the face and head as she lay in bed. The weapon, though not found immediately, was later identified as a mattock, a farming tool kept on the property. The brutality of the wounds, combined with the choice of weapon, left no doubt. This was not a crime of impulse. It had been deliberate, methodical. Investigators questioned neighbors, family members, and anyone who might have had contact with the Grubers in the days before the murders. Suspicion fell quickly on multiple individuals. One theory suggested that the murders were committed by a vagrant, someone passing through the countryside. Yet this seemed unlikely. A stranger would not have known the layout of the farm well enough to lure each family member into the barn one by one. Nor would a vagrant likely have stayed for days, tending animals and living inside the home. Attention then turned to people closer to the family. Victoria Gruber had long been the subject of village gossip. She was widowed after her husband died in World War I, and it was widely known that she had a complicated relationship with her father, Andreas. In fact, court records revealed that both Andreas and Victoria had previously been convicted of incest. This scandal had cast a dark shadow over the family, and many villagers whispered about the household behind closed doors. Could the motive for the crime have been rooted in these twisted family dynamics? Another possibility centered on Victoria's rumored lover, a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was a neighbor, and some believed he might have fathered Joseph, the youngest child. Schlittenbauer had once even been engaged to Victoria, though the relationship ended badly. He admitted to investigators that he believed Joseph was his son. This led some to speculate. Had jealousy or resentment driven him to kill? Or perhaps he sought to resolve the scandal of the Gruber family once and for all. When police questioned Schlittenbauer, his behavior raised eyebrows. He was among the neighbors who had discovered the bodies. Witnesses recalled that he seemed oddly calm, even when standing near the corpses. Some villagers said he had moved around the house with unusual familiarity, opening doors and handling objects as if he already knew where everything was. This earned him the suspicion of many in the community. Yet despite the gossip, authorities could not prove his involvement. Meanwhile, the investigation struggled with practical challenges. In 1922, forensic science was still in its infancy. There were no fingerprint analyses, no DNA testing, no modern crime scene methods. Investigators relied heavily on witness testimony, hunches, and physical observations. But with the crime scene compromised by curious villagers, much of the evidence was already contaminated. Theories multiplied. Some believed the killer had been hiding in the farmhouse before the murders, perhaps living in the attic or loft. This idea gained traction when neighbors recalled Andreas complaining about strange noises above the ceiling. Was it possible the murderer had been secretly watching the family for days, or even weeks, before striking? Others suspected robbery as the motive, though this did not align with the facts. Money and valuables were still found inside the house. Victoria's savings book remained untouched. If theft was the reason, the killer had strangely ignored it. As days turned into weeks, the authorities faced mounting pressure. Newspapers reported on the case with sensational headlines, dubbing it Germany's most mysterious murder. Villagers lived in fear, locking their doors at night and whispering about who among them might be capable of such horror. Yet despite exhaustive questioning, re-interviews, and endless speculation, the investigation made little progress. Dozens of suspects were considered, from family members to former farmhands to complete strangers. None could be definitively tied to the murders. In time, the case grew cold. The farmhouse itself, unable to shake its haunted reputation, stood as a grim reminder. Children avoided it. Adults crossed themselves when passing by. Some said they could still hear the cries of the murdered child echoing in the barn at night. Eventually, the farmhouse was demolished, but the legend of Hinterkaifeck remained. The investigation had revealed much about the brutality of the crime and the possible suspects. Yet the single question that mattered most, who committed the murders, remained unanswered. Chapter 5: Suspects and Theories. As the investigation unfolded, one thing became clear: there was no shortage of possible suspects in the Hinterkaifeck murders. Everyone from neighbors to drifters to family acquaintances came under scrutiny. Yet despite hundreds of interviews and endless speculation, no one was ever charged. What remains today is a tangled web of theories, some rooted in evidence, others in rumor, that still fascinate historians and true crime enthusiasts a century later. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor with a motive. Perhaps the most prominent suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a farmer who lived nearby. He had once been engaged to Victoria Gruber, but their relationship ended under complicated circumstances. Many villagers believed that Joseph, Victoria's 2-year-old son, was actually fathered by Lorenz. The scandal was compounded by the Gruber family's history of incest between Andreas and Victoria, making Joseph's parentage a subject of heated gossip. Lorenz himself admitted he believed Joseph was his child. He even attempted to claim responsibility for the boy at one point, though Andreas Gruber reportedly resisted, insisting that Lorenz had no rights over him. This situation created tension, and some wondered if resentment and jealousy might have boiled over into violence. What drew even more suspicion was Lorenz's behavior after the discovery of the bodies. Witnesses recalled him walking through the house with unusual familiarity, opening doors, and handling objects as though he knew the property well. He was also strangely calm for someone who had just stumbled upon such carnage. Villagers whispered, was this composure the mark of a murderer revisiting his crime? Despite these suspicions, Lorenz was questioned extensively and even later sued newspapers for defamation when they hinted at his guilt. Authorities could never find solid evidence to prove he was involved. The Gruber's family scandal. Another line of suspicion focused inward on the family itself. The Grubers were known to be a troubled household. Andreas, the patriarch, had a reputation for cruelty. His conviction for incest with Victoria cast a shadow of shame across the family name. Neighbors described him as harsh, controlling, and disliked by many. Victoria, meanwhile, seemed trapped, bound to her father, and unable to build a life beyond the farm. Some theories suggest that the murders may have been committed by someone seeking revenge for the family's disgraceful behavior. Perhaps a former farmhand or relative who despised Andreas, or even someone within the family circle who had finally reached a breaking point. The fact that the killer used a farm tool, a mattock, rather than bringing a weapon, fueled speculation that this was someone familiar with rural life, not an outsider. The stranger in the attic theory. One of the most chilling theories was born from an account Andreas gave to neighbors shortly before the murders. He complained of hearing strange noises in the attic, footsteps when no one was supposed to be there. He also mentioned finding an unfamiliar newspaper in the house and seeing footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the farm, but none leading back. These details suggested that someone may have been secretly living in the farmhouse in the days, or even weeks, before the murders. Perhaps the killer observed the family, learned their habits, and then struck at the opportune moment. While this theory is compelling, no concrete evidence ever proved that an intruder had been hiding in the attic. Still, for many, the idea of the family being stalked in their own home remains one of the most terrifying aspects of the case. Robbery gone wrong. Investigators also considered robbery as a motive. Rural farms were sometimes targeted by bandits, especially in the unstable years following World War I. Germany was struggling economically, and desperation drove some to violent crime. But robbery seemed unlikely here. The family's savings book, cash, and valuables were left untouched. Nothing of significant worth was taken. If thieves had committed the crime, why linger at the scene for days, caring for animals and eating meals in the kitchen? It was behavior that made little sense for common robbers. Wartime ghosts, soldiers, and drifters. Another theory suggested the involvement of former soldiers or deserters wandering the countryside. In 1922, the scars of the Great War were still fresh. Many veterans returned home broken, jobless, and haunted by violence. Some drifted through rural Bavaria in search of work or shelter. Could one of them have targeted Hinterkaifeck? The brutality of the killings, the methodical blows to the head, the calmness to stay afterward, led some to think of a man hardened by war, capable of cruelty without remorse. Yet, again, no evidence surfaced to tie any vagrant or soldier to the crime. Multiple killers. A darker theory considered the possibility of more than one perpetrator. The murders required luring several family members into the barn one by one without raising alarm. Could a single person have managed this so cleanly? If two or more killers were involved, it would explain how the murders unfolded so swiftly and silently. Yet if multiple people knew the truth, why had no one confessed, even decades later? The silence that surrounded the case suggested either a lone killer or a pact of secrecy that was never broken. The lingering presence. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case was the killer's decision to stay on the farm for several days after the murders. The animals were cared for, meals were cooked, the fire burned in the stove. This behavior suggested someone who was strangely comfortable at Hinterkaifeck, someone unafraid of discovery, unhurried, and deeply familiar with farm life. This detail alone has kept suspicion focused on locals rather than strangers. A passerby would likely have fled immediately. Only someone with a connection, whether emotional, personal, or territorial, would linger among the dead. Why no arrests were ever made? Despite interviewing over 100 suspects, police could never gather enough evidence to charge anyone. The lack of forensic technology, combined with the contamination of the crime scene, doomed the investigation from the start. Over the years, new suspects were occasionally named and files reopened, but the same problem remained: no solid proof. In 2007, modern investigators reviewed the case with today's methods, but concluded that solving it definitively would be impossible. Too much time had passed, too much evidence lost. Theories that endure. Today, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Germany's most infamous unsolved crimes. Some believe it was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, driven by jealousy or bitterness. Others hold fast to the theory of the stranger in the attic, a killer who stalked the family like prey. And some suggest a family enemy, or even multiple attackers exacting revenge for long-held grudges. Whatever the truth, the case endures not just because it is unsolved, but because of its haunting details: the footsteps in the snow, the family drawn into the barn one by one, the killer calmly living in the house afterward. These elements give the story a chilling, almost unreal quality, as though it belongs as much to folklore as to history. Chapter 6: Legacy and Cultural Impact. The murders at Hinterkaifeck remain one of the most enduring mysteries in German criminal history. A century later, people still travel to the site, read about the case, and debate its countless theories. Part of the fascination lies in the brutality of the crime, but much of it comes from the eerie details that feel more like legend than fact. A case that never died. Unlike many rural crimes of the early 20th century, the Hinterkaifeck murders never faded into obscurity. Instead, the case took on a life of its own, whispered about in villages, retold in newspapers, and eventually analyzed in documentaries, podcasts, and books. The lack of resolution has allowed the story to grow, taking on a folklore quality. In Bavaria, the tale is passed down almost like a ghost story, a cautionary reminder of how evil can strike even in the most isolated, humble of places. The farm after the murders. In the months following the massacre, the farm became a grim landmark. Curious visitors traveled from nearby towns to see the place for themselves. Some came out of fear, others out of morbid fascination. Local authorities eventually demolished the farmhouse in 1923, believing it was too stained by horror to remain standing. But demolition did not erase the memory. The site became a sort of unspoken monument. Today, a small shrine marks where the farmhouse once stood. Visitors still bring flowers or pause in silence, reflecting on the tragedy that unfolded there. Impact on forensics and policing. The Hinterkaifeck murders also highlighted the limitations of early 20th century policing. Crime scene management was poor. Villagers, priests, and even curious neighbors walked freely across the site, disturbing evidence. Investigators had little in the way of forensic tools. Fingerprint analysis was primitive DNA analysis was decades away, and psychological profiling was non-existent. For many modern criminologists, the case is a study in how investigative failures can allow mysteries to remain unsolved forever. It also underscores how much of crime solving depends not just on technology, but on the careful preservation of a scene, something tragically mishandled at Hinterkaifeck. The cultural fascination with unsolved crimes. Why does Hinterkaifeck continue to grip the imagination when countless other murders are forgotten? Part of the answer lies in the human fascination with the unknown. Unsolved crimes invite endless speculation. They allow us to play detective, to imagine motives, to search for patterns that may or may not be there. But Hinterkaifeck offers more than mystery. It is a story full of haunting atmosphere, a lonely farmhouse, footprints in the snow, whispers of a presence in the attic, a killer who tended animals after slaughtering their owners. These elements stir the imagination in ways that pure facts alone cannot. Modern interpretations. Over the years, filmmakers, authors, and musicians have drawn inspiration from the case. Documentaries have explored it with forensic reconstructions. Crime writers have fictionalized it, blending history with speculation. In popular culture, it is often referenced alongside Jack the Ripper or the Black Dahlia as one of history's great unsolved crimes. Podcasts and YouTube channels retell the story to audiences far beyond Germany. Listeners find themselves captivated not just by the brutality, but by the dreamlike eeriness of it all. For some, the story feels almost like a creepypasta written decades before the internet, a tale that should not be true, and yet is. The family remembered. Amid the mystery, it is easy to forget the victims themselves. The Grubers, Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, little Kazilia, Joseph, and the maid Maria, were not symbols of a crime, but real people whose lives ended violently. Their struggles, secrets, and daily routines were swept away in a single night of horror. To this day, descendants of villagers who knew the Grubers sometimes share stories. Some describe Andreas as cruel, others as a strict farmer of his time. Some recall Victoria's singing voice in the church choir. These fragments remind us that beneath the theories and speculation lies a real tragedy, a family destroyed, their lives reduced to whispers of rumor. What Hinterkaifeck teaches us. The case remains unsolved not because it was impossible, but because too much was lost in those crucial first days. Evidence was trampled, suspects were not properly interrogated, and leads went cold. It is a reminder of how fragile justice can be, especially in eras when crime-solving relied as much on rumor as on science. At the same time, the story teaches us something about human nature. It shows how mystery draws us in, how we search for answers even when none are possible, and it reveals the unsettling truth that sometimes evil acts have no resolution, no explanation, no neat ending. The silence that remains. In the end, the Hinterkaifeck murders leave us with silence. The silence of a farmhouse that once echoed with footsteps in the attic. The silence of unanswered questions. The silence of a family buried without justice. That silence, paradoxically, is what keeps the story alive. Each generation returns to it, wondering if they will see a detail missed before, if they will glimpse the shadow of the killer who walked through the snow that night and never looked back. Conclusion. The Hinterkaifeck murders of 1922 remain a chilling reminder of the darkness that can strike in the most ordinary of places. The case has become part true crime, part folklore, a story retold across decades not only because of its brutality, but because of its enduring mystery. Perfect for anyone who loves creepy history, haunted places, and chilling stories, Hinterkaifeck stands as both tragedy and legend. It is a story without an ending, and perhaps that is why it will never be forgotten.